Hello everyone, and welcome to this special webinar on transition to practice for new graduate occupational therapists. My name's Anita Volkert and I'll be presenting the materials today. So without further ado, I'll share my slides and we'll start the presentation. Okay, so you now should be able to see my screen and also hopefully a little box of me. So transition into practice is today's topic. That came as a request through from a range of new graduate occupational therapists who were reaching the end of their studies and were really thinking about what the next step might look like. Just bear with me while I move. Yep, okay. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders, past and present. And a little bit about me before we go on. I'm an occupational therapist with 25 years experience, a little bit more than that actually now, currently in a national leadership role with Occupational Therapy Australia. And I have a background as an OT, as a clinician in both physical and mental health, so I've worked right across the spectrum. And I've also managed services, I've taught occupational therapy, and I've held down policy roles as well. And actually have done that across 3 countries, that's Australia, England and Scotland. And I was really drawn to OT as it seemed like a useful role, but it also seemed very portable and it seemed like a role you could travel with, which was certainly true for me. It's held up over a long career for me. I've never been bored. I've been able to change the kind of work I've been doing when I felt a bit stuck or felt like I needed a new challenge. And hence I am, over 25 years later, still an occupational therapist. I have done some study as well. I think it's good to keep your ability to look at evidence and use evidence and generate it up over a long career. So I did some postgraduate study in narrative approaches, in community development, and actually in the topic we're talking about today, education and transition into practice. And I'll be talking a little bit about my own research as we go through. Apologies if my voice is a little croaky. I've got some seasonal hay fever today. So it's a sign that spring is coming. Okay, so our objectives today are to introduce the context of the current OT new graduate working environment. And it's quite different to how it used to look, so I think it's worth talking about that. I'd like to think about the experience of transition to practice that we know about from new graduates themselves. And that's some of the results of my research. And I'd like us to just have a look at the useful strategies that might support your transition into practice as you go forward. So let's start with that first point, the context, what the new graduate working environment looks like now. So there is good news. It is probably one of the best times to be an occupational therapist right now that you could ever have chosen. That's arguable because there are some factors that influence what that experience is like, but in terms of demand for our profession, it's at a very, very high rate right now. New funding schemes, such as the NDIS, have resulted in really high demand for occupational therapists, and they bring with them an increased focus on participation as an outcome. And that means they're in harmony with our philosophy and practice by and large. And that's really different for us as OTs. I think we were formerly quite shoehorned into a medical model. That still happens to a degree. But schemes like the NDIS and like some of the other schemes we see coming online, we not quite apparent yet, but I think we will see it with aged care, for example. We will see this focus on participation and wellbeing. And it really speaks to us as a profession, and it places us front and centre in the service deliverers of those schemes. And that's really what we've seen with the NDIS. What's also happened is that we've had increases in university places and increases in courses over the last 10 years in Australia, and that's given us quite a young profession in terms of where people are at in their career, not necessarily in terms of age, because people aren't always young when they start. But generally speaking, the majority of OT registrants are under 35 years of age with quite long careers heading out beyond them. And that gives our profession quite a future-focused energy, which I'm really excited about. It means we've got lots of high-calibre graduates around, ready to start a complex professional practice career, but also interested, I hope, in things like generating evidence and generating research and having quite a varied career as well. So I think it's a really exciting time for us as to be an OT and within our profession. So there's great news. Certainly, I think probably one of the things new graduates are always worried about is job prospects, and your job prospects are really good, but it's just they might not look like job prospects used to look. So that's the kind of flip side, which I'm going to come on to now. So there is a bit of a flip side. A high demand for occupational therapists, which we are struggling a bit to meet, does mean that the jobs you go into may have high caseloads. They may be requiring you to do complex work with limited support. And that limited support is really around the fact that we have this large group of younger professionals within occupational therapy, but we don't have so many people who are heavily experienced. And so each of those very experienced OTs has got a large group of people to support. We also have, entering into healthcare and social care, lots of new organisations who've never really employed allied health professions or OTs before, and they don't have a structure in place to provide support. So that's kind of one of the issues with how the jobs are looking. Nearly all of the new roles, the new jobs, have occurred outside of the traditional sector. So what we traditionally thought of as health services were sort of our government-run health services, hospitals, community centres, that kind of sector. There's been limited growth in that sector. If anything, there's probably been a contraction. But what has happened is that we've had this exponential growth in non-government organisations, charities, and large private practices who are now employing occupational therapists. And that's the difference in the type of employment that we're seeing. And it's those new sectors that are really exciting because they're offering lots of demand and they're working with the new schemes, but they may not have structures and support in place for you. So that's the thing to think about. The other issue is that some of these roles are quite poorly developed. So they may not have been worked up well within these new organisations that are offering them. And some actually have some limitations by their particular funding scheme. And one example of that is residential aged care roles. There's quite a bit of a market for OTs at the moment in residential aged care, but the role for OT can be quite limited in those roles, and it's limited by the way it's funded. So it's not necessarily those organisations sort of not understanding, although that's sometimes the case, but they're actually limited by what an OT can do because the funding scheme limits that. So sometimes we see OTs go into residential aged care and their role, the requirements for their role is to do massages. And when new graduates phone me and ask me about that, I usually say, to be perfectly honest, I would suggest you start to expand your search and you start to look elsewhere for a truly fulfilling occupational therapy role. If you can, however, do individualised assessment, group interventions, environmental assessment, falls prevention as part of that residential aged care role, by all means continue. But if it's very, very restricted and limited, have a think about whether that's the right fit for you. So there's a bit of a flip side to the growth in demand. The other flip side we're seeing with these high demand, high complex, poorly developed roles that may not have a great deal of support, is that we're seeing a bit of stress and burnout amongst new graduates. So that's really something to monitor in yourself. It's no major issue early on in a career if you move about a little bit. In fact, that's something we do see in the new graduate experience. So if a role is not feeling right for you, if it's taking a toll on your health and you've taken steps to address that and it's still not being addressed, then by all means an option is to have a look at what other options are available for you. So what is the general picture? Where are we going with the allied health professionals in Australia? What will our jobs look like in 5 years' time or in 10 years' time? And there's quite a bit of work going on in this space at the moment, so I thought it was worth sharing that with you. What we know is that it's difficult to predict what a allied health professional job will look like even in 5 years, let alone 10 years. One of the things that we know is that there's going to be a much more increased use of artificial intelligence and of IT, information technology. Now, that doesn't mean that we won't have jobs and that robots will be doing our jobs, but what it does mean is some of the more routine aspects of our work in 10 years' time probably won't be something we need to do. That means that universities educating today need to make sure that their graduates are ready to work, but they don't want to pigeonhole you necessarily into being ready for specific job roles. So our graduates today tend to be work ready with all the professional behaviours and the self-management skills, these all will be familiar from your SPEFA, to do a role, but the specifics of that job will need to be taught as you go into it. So that's something to bear in mind. If you feel like you get into your first role and you think, I don't really understand what the everyday requirements of this job are, that's okay. That's actually deliberate in a way, because that job is going to change quite quickly. The other thing that you will need to be doing within the next 5 or 10 years is what we call working to top of scope. So again, it's those routine tasks you'll need to do less. And possibly an example of that is in community health services, where historically we've had OTs do pretty routine assessments around very minor home modifications for older people, not complex at all, very minor. That's more of a routine task that may disappear over time. It either may be done by another group or it may be done by some kind of different intelligence system, freeing up our OTs to do more complex home modifications. And that's the kind of working to top of scope example that we may see rolling out over the next 5 to 10 years. We want our allied health professionals to be able to work with complex populations, people who have a mix of chronic conditions, perhaps some frailty within that falls risks, older as our population ages, and probably have some comorbidities, some currently coexisting mental health issues, disability issues, maybe disadvantage, and the approach that health professionals need to take is a re-ablement focus. So people restoring function, restoring as much wellness as possible, and ideally remaining within their own homes or remaining in a community situation. So that's the direction that we kind of need our allied health workforce to take. We also need people to be very digitally literate. I'm sure that most of you new graduates are, but don't let those skills lapse once you're out in the workplace. Not all workplaces have great exposure to digital technology, so try and keep your kind of ear to the ground and your skills well honed in that area, because they'll be a really useful one for you to keep developing. And we also need you to be quite agile in terms of, not necessarily physically, but more in terms of how you think about work, and be able to shift focus quite quickly and cope with a lot of change. Some of the future focus stuff I've been to for government has said that the changes we're going to see in the health sector brought on by artificial intelligence and information technology in the next 10 years will be the same as we've seen in the last 100 years. So that's how quickly we might see things change. So you need to be ready for that as a health professional starting your career now. Again, what things look like in 10 years will be completely different today, so you need to kind of roll with that and be ready for those changes and cope with them. Taking a positive attitude really helps, and there's lots and lots of research around resilience, particularly, that shows whilst we may not be able to do much about the situations we're in, if we take a positive perspective on those, half the battle for resilience is won. So just kind of taking that positive spin. Your role might be changing, how you do your work might change quite quickly, the people around you might change. Take that positive perspective, a learning approach, and just keep moving forward. And being quite problem solving in your focus, and not relying too heavily on protocols and recipes. A little bit of a difficult one, because I think particularly early on in your career it's useful to have some protocols and recipes, but as you get more confident, just be kind of more comfortable with that more lateral thinking. So that's again something maybe to think about, something to develop in your own mind. and just feeling comfortable with working across services and across different sectors. So you can see in my career, I worked across mental health and physical health pretty much evenly across my career, and so being prepared to do a little bit more of that and being quite flexible with your hours. I think we will see quite a lot of shift in that traditional idea of a Monday to Friday 9 to 5 really moving on in the allied health professional world. And it's certainly true to say that some of our OTs who go straight into services like e-Headspace, for example, work 24-hour shift work, and that's becoming really not unusual at all, whereas probably 10 years ago it would have been. Okay, so that's a little bit about our future allied health professional workforce and the context you're going into. Let's talk a little bit about what the experience is actually like to transition into practice for new graduates, and this comes out of some interviews that I did. So what I did is I interviewed two cohorts, two groups, new graduate OTs and supervisors. It was a pretty small sample, it was qualitative and it was exploratory, so I say that to you just so that we can get a sense of, whilst these are interesting findings and that they give us a sense of what is going on, they're not necessarily generalisable right across the world population. And in case anybody's a research nerd, I used a sort of constructivist, interpretivist case study, thematic content analysis approach in this. And I sourced the new graduates from one university, but supervisors were sourced nationwide. So what did I find? And what I found was universally, every single new graduate felt extremely daunted at entering practice. Like, I mean, extremely daunted. And that finding was borne out in the wider allied health professional literature and the historical literature. And that kind of relates to what I was saying before about mostly OTs feel work ready. They feel ready to join the workforce, but they don't feel ready for the specific job they go into. And that first stage of learning is quite a painful process in many ways. That feeling of dauntedness caused extreme short-term distress in the first 3 months, and it actually caused some job mobility. Some OTs did not stay with the first job they found and job hopped a little bit in that first 3 to 6 months to try and find something that felt not quite so overwhelming. One of my participants, I interviewed her for an hour and a half on the phone and she cried the whole way through the interview. She did contact me later to say that that was a useful experience for her because she got some of her emotion out. I was quite worried about her. But that's kind of the level of distress people were at. And her distress was really around, I don't know what to do and I feel really stupid on an everyday basis because I just don't know what to do. I don't know how to do the actual job. But that was a feeling shared by most new graduates in that first 3 months. And the reason I tell you this is not to put you off, but to tell you that if you feel that way in the first 12 weeks of your job, that is a normal experience. That is absolutely how every allied health professional feels in the first 3 months transitioning into practice. They feel completely out of their depth. They feel completely daunted. They may end in tears, either at work or after work. And it may be a very distressing experience and difficult to sit with. So get ready for that now. Think about what structures and supports you can have in place to help you through that first 3 months, whether it's going home every night, putting your pajamas on and watching Netflix, whether it's going and meeting friends every couple of days so that you can do some debriefing, whether it's finding some good supervision. And I'll go on to some of those recommendations about how to support in a minute. The good news is that by 6 months, most people felt more confident and much more established. And by 18 months, many actually were saying, look, I literally feel like an old hand now. I feel like I really know what I'm doing. In fact, some people were starting to say they were bored. So that had gone from 3 months, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm completely overwhelmed and I'm completely out of my depth, to 18 months later, people saying, well, actually, I'm a bit bored and I'm looking for my next role now. I'm looking to go up a step. So that was really quite a common pattern. Quite a few people who I think had probably just taken the first job that came up as well, between that 6 month and 18 month period, often moved on because of the fit wasn't quite right. So they'd taken a job, it wasn't quite right for them. They actually were more interested in another type of work or something that felt like a better fit in terms of culture or team dynamics or supervisory support had come up for them. So there is a fair bit of job mobility in the first 2 years of practice, and that's okay, actually. There's a little bit of research that says that's needed. and I'll say more about that in a minute. Some of the key development areas that new graduates felt they needed and their supervisors felt they needed were around what we call core skills. Now, that was an interesting one because then I did a lot of questioning with people around what core skills are. So if you're a new graduate, what new graduates identified as core skills were things like, doing a showering assessment, ADL assessment, fitting equipment, doing a mental state examination, running a group, the real practical do the job skills. But when I asked their supervisors, they weren't that fussed about that, except in some specific areas of practice. So in acute services, like acute discharge services, they were like, they really need to know how to do an assessment, fit some rails and get people home. They were more focused on new graduates being able to understand the focus of the profession around enablement and outcome, and having that outcome of participation and occupation. So kind of interesting, really. And that was probably just that perspective of a more experienced OT who kind of feels on top of the core skills, that not being front and centre of their mind, whereas the new graduates in that experience were saying, whoa, what we really need is development around these areas. Okay, so that's just probably worth you paying note to, really. Those core skills shifted a bit depending on what the role was, and one would expect that too. But I did think it was interesting, and I thought it kind of relates to some of our issues as a profession around explaining what we are. So everyone struggled a bit to say what the core skills actually were. Yeah, so an interesting thing to think about. What the new graduates said was discussion-based supervision and support was the most useful during this period. So some organisations had competency-based checklists as a support approach. So, can you do X, Y, or Z? And one would think that relates back to that core skill thing. Can you fit a piece of equipment? Tick, tick, tick. And whilst there's some use to that, in terms of actually supporting the experience of transition to practice, it actually was sitting down and having a conversation with a supervisor or a mentor or a group of peers or some kind of support strategy was actually more useful than that. And interestingly, for those of you listening who've had a role emerging placement, a placement in which there was limited OT support and you had to perhaps set up some OT services or do a piece of project work based around occupational therapy in a more sole way or with a group of students without supervisors around all the time, they were identified as the single most useful placement learning experience reported by new graduates. And this study was completed in the UK, where all students have a role emerging placement. So they all then stated that that was actually the most useful in terms of transition to practice. And it was not because that was a particularly great experience for all of them, it wasn't necessarily, but because it was the first time they'd been placed in a situation without support around them all the time, which mirrored their experience of being a new graduate when they had to actually strike out on their own. So that was interesting. So if you've had a role emerging placement and you think, well, what was the point of that? There probably was a point to it. Okay, so what can we say? What are the recommendations that might ease your transition? So I've got a bit of a list here and I'll talk my way through them. So the key task, according to the literature, that a new graduate is trying to do at the stage of transition into practice is to understand what experienced professionals are able to do inside their heads. They need to know how to get from that one point to the next. How do you know what to do? So you go in and you assess a client and a bunch of issues are raised. How do you then know what interventions you're going to do? So how is that decision-making process happening? What factors are you taking into account? Are you drawing on knowledge from experience? Are you drawing on knowledge from research and textbooks? Probably a bit of both, actually. How is that happening? The only way you can do this is by talking, watching and copying, right? So talking and asking your experienced professionals, and they don't have to be OTs necessarily. Sometimes it's just about that process of being able to do that clinical reasoning. Ask people how they're doing it, seek clarification, ask them what they took into account, ask them if they did that from an experience in the past, ask them if they did it on the basis of a course that they might have done, ask it if they did it on the basis of research and evidence. It's okay to ask those questions. Watch what your experienced professionals are doing, and that might be a specific thing like fitting a piece of equipment, or it might be running a group, or it might be doing an advanced assessment with a complex client. Watch what they're doing and then try to mirror or copy that in your own way of doing it. Whether that person, it's ideal if you can copy or mirror when that person is still around and they can give you some feedback. If they can't, just take it away and do it when you're out on your own with people as well, and give yourself some feedback and sort of develop that ability as far as it's possible to do, to sort of stand back and almost watch yourself doing it and try to give yourself that feedback as well. So ask lots of questions of your experienced practitioners, whatever professional background they are. It's ideal if they're OTs, but if they're not, you'll still learn something. Seek clarification. How did they come to those decisions? What else did they consider? If there's anything you don't understand, if a jump has been made that's too quick, like, well, I've just seen Mr. X and this is what's going on with him, so we're going to do this. How did you get to that point? Can you talk me through the things that you thought about in your own mind that got you from these are the issues, this is what we're going to do? Watch those practitioners, copy or mirror what they do, get feedback if you can. And if there are no experienced practitioners available to you, and some of our new graduates are in that situation, talk to your organisation about the fact that you are a new graduate and can they help you set up some structures where you can shadow or mentor people who are outside of the organisation or in another geographic location, maybe for a day, a series of days, or some sessions somewhere else. Remember, our profession is in demand. An organisation will be trying to recruit you and trying to keep you, so you do have a little bit of bargaining. And if you feel like you need some support that's external, then it's certainly worth having a good professional conversation about how that could be arranged for you. Any supervision you have access to, and it may be with an OT and it may be with another professional, or it could just be with a sort of departmental head who may or may not have a health background, whatever that is, make it as discussion based as possible. Sometimes supervision can be quite transfer of knowledge. So these are the key policies and I need to remind everybody to complete the fire training or whatever. Get that stuff out of the way if it needs to go out of the way, but try and carve out some time where you can talk about your practice, even really if all that person is doing is listening, reflecting back, and maybe offering some of their perspectives based on their own profession. If they're a speech and language therapist or a physio, for example, they may have some points that they can talk to you about in terms of thinking through cases, in terms of communication skills and so forth, and generating new knowledge or finding ways to get support. They'll certainly have some ideas about those. Focus on good and difficult experiences. You learn from both, and so it's worth discussing both. Make use of your peer networks, both formal and informal. So that's a great place to use your friendship groups from uni, but also any peers that you have access to, again, both OT and more broadly in your workplace, and have some discussions there, but do remember confidentiality. So if you're having a more social discussion down at the coffee shop with some old friends, do be careful about how you use names and recognisable details around people you're talking about. If your organisation has some different types of services and you're employed in one of them, see if you can get some experience across those services, even if it's just a bit of shadowing and mentoring or visiting. That the research tells us that that's really helpful for new graduates, actually. Talk to your more experienced staff about how they've coped with stress in their career and take whatever learning you can from that, because we know that's quite a big issue for people. And always encourage your supervisors to pay attention to their own development, because the research also tells us that supervisors need to be supported. If you're feeling really stressed or burnt out quite early on in your career, go back through these points and see that you're doing all of them. But also the research tells us that mindfulness and meditation works really well for that. So if that's not something you've ever tried, try that as well. There's lots of apps, there's lots of groups, there's lots of online support for that. Okay, so that's doing all of those things should help you really understand what OT looks and feels like in practice, help you feel like an OT and belong to the wider network of OTs, but also help you understand that you won't immediately feel like that, and those things will fluctuate over your career. And some contexts of practice and roles support those better than others. I've always said, that as an OT, a lot of it is about picking a job that's a really good fit for you, because it's such a broad, diverse profession. It'll help you make complex decisions in practice as time goes on, and you'll get to become truly person-centred and get some really good outcomes. So some really good responses to those recommendations. Okay, and how can OTA support you? So we have frameworks for practice, we have position papers, guides and competencies available. We have a mentor-link scheme, which is open to all new graduates, really from the day that you graduate. We have a lovely About OT website that we're doing some work on, and we have Find an OT, which has supervisors are listed there, so take a look at that. We give you access to CPD, and we do run some foundation skills programs for new graduates on a regular basis. So there are one day where you get a sort of quick hit into foundation physical skills and foundational mental health skills. And we have access to some of your evidence-based resources, which can get hard to find after uni. We have interest groups and regional groups and networks like this one. And we have events, and we have an exciting one coming up next year in June, our OT Exchange, which is an inclusive event open to all. You might want to think about putting in an abstract or just setting aside that time to come along and find out about some of these key practice areas: driving, environmental mods, PEDS and rehab, but there's also not limited to that, so there's more than just that going on as well. Wishing you all the best in your career. My email is standards@otoz.com.au. I'll be doing a Q&A live on Facebook next week following this presentation, and please contact me for the reference list if you would like it. We're on all the socials, so please do sign up and join us. Thanks very much, everyone. Bye.